Good morning. I'm Victoria McEwing, Managing Director of Glenigan, and we'd like to welcome you to the webinar where we are launching our construction industry forecast for 2020 and 2021. Now, on a day where our Prime Minister Boris Johnson sets out his plans to invest billions of pounds in infrastructure and education to revive the UK economy and to mitigate the impact of the coronavirus lockdown, we have factored into our forecast all of these investments. Needless to say, it has been an unprecedented start to the year, and with a challenging economic outlook ahead, we hope that our forecast helps you to plan and better prepare your business over the next 24 months and beyond. So I'm joined today by a panel of experts. Glenigan's Economics Director and author of our forecast, Alan Wellen.
Hello.
Glenigan's Content Director, Robert Davis.
Good morning.
And Rebecca Evans, Director of Content at our sister company, De Havilland, who provide political intelligence and will be offering us an insight into the political landscape that we find ourselves in.
Morning.
So the full forecast report offers more detail than we are able to cover here today. It includes how different sectors within the industry are anticipated to fare, so please do make sure that you read a copy. Glenigan customers can find it within the Insights section of our website, and if you're not a customer, you can download a copy. The link should be on the screen throughout this broadcast, or you can find it in the YouTube in the details of the webinar. So, to kick us off today, Alan is going to give us a 10-minute overview of our forecast before we hand over to Rebecca for insight into the economic and political factors that we should be aware of. We will do our best to answer the questions that you have been submitting before the broadcast, but if you do have any questions that come out throughout, please send them in the chat function and we'll do our best to answer them. So, without further ado, I'll pass to Alan.
Thanks, Vicky. Yes, I think at the outset what I'd like to do really is explain a little bit of the background behind this current set of forecasts. Clearly, we're in exceptional circumstances at the moment, with a high degree of uncertainty facing the outlook for not just for construction but for the world economy and the UK economy. So we've constructed our forecasts in the usual way. They're based on analysis of Glenigan's data modelled against wider macroeconomic and market data. But what we've done this time, we've taken some further additional analysis. Certainly, we've looked at the assumptions for the course of the UK economy, but also for the pandemic itself. And we've also tried to take into account the potential changes that the pandemic has been having really on historic trends and relationships across the wider economy and within construction sectors. And I think we've tried to hopefully incorporate those into our logic and behind the current forecasts. And not only that, we've constructed our key central forecast, which is how we see things playing out, but also two alternative scenarios. And I'll say a little bit more about those in a moment. But in terms of the key assumptions behind our central forecast, and actually, I think the key first point applies to all of the different scenarios, is that actually we anticipate that May was the low point from a construction perspective, certainly in terms of construction output, and certainly the second quarter in terms of project starts, and that we're now sort of entering a recovery phase, and it's the shape and the form of that recovery that's going to be the key challenge and insight hopefully we're going to be able to provide with you today. I think the first thing to say is that certainly in the course of the rest of this year, the construction industry is facing the challenge of operating sites with reduced staffing, really from as they try to apply the health and safety measures required by the pandemic, and that's really going to hit the pace of recovery, both in terms of activity on site, but also in terms of new project starts during the course of 2020, and then as we get into 2021 as well to a certain extent. The wider economic picture, clearly we face a recession this year and weak economic growth and recovery as we get into 2021 and 2022. And effectively that's going to have an impact on the wider economy and the pace of and pattern of construction activity. There's clearly been disruption to business investment and confidence, and that's going to have particular implications for industrial and commercial activity, which I'll come on to in a few moments. Rising unemployment and weak household earnings again are going to be a factor, again holding back particularly things in consumer-facing areas such as retail and private housing activity. And alongside that, as Vicky said, government is planning to increase investment, and that's going to be a key driver, I think, for the economy over the whole forecast period, really, as that increased investment comes forward in a number of important sectors for construction. The other key elements behind our forecast is one, in terms of the pandemic, we anticipate there's going to be no sort of second wave that would require significant national lockdown as we saw earlier this year in the second quarter. Yes, we've seen today, for example, in Leicester, where there's a sort of localized action being taken, and we can see, I think we'll probably see more of that over the course of the next 6-9 months. But in our central forecast is that we avoid any need for a return to the national picture that we saw and the disruption that would have on construction activity and the wider economy that we saw in the second quarter. And then the other one is the long forgotten big impact. It's been sort of overshadowed by the virus, which is Brexit, and that we anticipate will happen at the end of the year. That we'll finally leave the transition period with a limited treaty in place, which means that trade will continue, but there will be costs involved in that. And that will have some implications for supply chains, for example, as we get into 2021. Alongside that, we've put together, as I say, a couple of forecasts, and you can see those on the slide there. The central line there is our central forecast, but we've got a best and a worst case scenario. And the best case one really is that we see a more rapid adjustment by the industry to the working practices, and they can get that productivity back up more quickly than in our central forecast. Also, in terms of Brexit, that there's perhaps greater political flexibility from both sides, which allows some side of fix that it means that we can carry on trading during perhaps some sort of not a proxy transition period, effectively. And that also we see a faster delivery than in our central forecast of promised government investment. And again, that has a major boost to construction activity. And alongside all of that, and perhaps on the back of that, we see a stronger recovery in the wider economy, which obviously builds consumer confidence and business investment as well over the forecast period. Conversely, the orange line on your screens is our worst case scenario. And that, I guess, a key assumption in that is actually a concern that there would be a second wave that would necessitate a renewed lockdown. And that would have implications not just for construction, but for the wider economy, delaying the economic recovery on the back of that. So weaker economic performance, public investment, slower to pick up than we would anticipate in our central forecast, and a weaker overall UK performance, not least because as well as that in our central assumption, we're assuming that we leave at the end of the year from the EU. The final completion is more of a cliff edge with very limited or no trade agreement in place, and us effectively reverting to WHO rules for trade with Europe. So there's the three scenarios that we've got. But as I say, our central forecast is how we anticipate things are going to unfold over the next 2.5 years. And I think it'll be useful to say a little bit more about the individual sectors within that briefly at this stage. Firstly, if you look at the sort of residential sectors, these are perhaps been the slowest areas to recover from the initial impact and disruption from the virus in the second quarter. I think that a lot of that's to do with the nature of the sites, because it has affected both affordable housing construction and private residential construction. But I think what we are seeing now is sites are being unlocked and coming back on stream. The priority, I think, from a private house builders' perspective, has been to look at sites that were nearing completion One, that means that they will need fewer people on site to complete them, so it works from a social distancing perspective. But also means those houses completed can then be released and generate income for the house builders. So that's been their focus, and as a result of that, further down the line, I think housing starts, in terms of project starts, are slower to pick up and recover. So that, as you can see from our graph, that's a sort of a sharper fall this year and a more gradual recovery in private housing activity during the course of the subsequent 2 years. In terms of affordable housing, a much more positive picture. Still very much caught up this year in the initial adjustment to the virus and response to that, but quite a sharp bounce back as we get into 2021, 2022, very much on the relaxation of restrictions on housing associations' financial plans, but also on the back of increased government support for social housing provision, all of which means that's going to be a growth sector in terms of affordable housing delivery over the forecast period. Moving on to industrial and commercial, very much obviously tied up with business investment and confidence. And here I get a lot of weakness, reflecting that lack of business confidence in the sort of, certainly in the near term, with a gradual recovery in 2021 and to some extent in 2022 as well. But within that, there's some sharp divergence between individual sectors. Retail construction, for example, is probably the worst affected area. It was already an area of weakness, really. It's been hit by structural change in the market, something that's been exacerbated during the pandemic, with more sales going online. And just in the last week, we've seen one of the major shopping centres going into administration. It's not the only one to be suffering. A lot of them are seeing increase in voids and late or no payment of rent from retailers. So that sector is clearly struggling, and we see very little new investment coming into that area in terms of new retail construction over the forecast period. I think there will be some opportunities as well, though, obviously in the refurbishment and repurposing of premises. And the flip side of that is actually on the industrial sector, where that strong growth that we've already seen in online sales and that acceleration in that over the forecast period is going to drive more investment in logistic and warehousing space. And that's going to be a real growth area within the industrial sector, which I suspect, is going to offset some weakness in manufacturing investment in premises over the forecast period. The other two areas obviously are hotel and leisure and offices. Hotel and leisure, similarly, the hospitality industry has been the last part of the economy to be unlocked. Clearly, businesses there are under pressure in terms of their cash flow and revenue position, and I think that's going to act as something of a brake certainly in the near term for growth in investment in new premises. Further out, I think things will come back quite strongly, but I think certainly in the first half of the forecast, that's going to be an area of weakness. In terms of offices, again, I think new build opportunities. I think there's going to be some longer term reconsideration of the need and requirements between firms for office accommodation. But near term, I think it's going to be a lot of opportunities for refurbishment and repurposing of offices as well, as people adjust to the new ways of working and what that means for the office spaces that they've already got. So fit out side of things, I think, is looking a lot more positive perhaps than just generally the new build side of things. But I think the real growth and opportunities over the forecast period is going to be on the government side of things, and that's quite a change really from what we've seen prior to up to 2019, effectively, where it's been very much driven by the private sector. I think over the forecast period, we expect civil engineering and public non-residential projects to be the real growth area, whether that's health, education, community and amenity projects, or in terms of the built infrastructure, particularly roads and rail. I think where all those are going to be growth areas. How quickly they grow will be determined by how quickly government programs are rolled out over the forecast period. And Vicky, as you were saying, we've got a number of announcements from the from the sort of Prime Minister today on that front. And it's going to be a key element within our forecast. We can see particularly infrastructure growing strongly over the forecast period. That's fundamental for our forecast. But Rebecca, it'd be quite interesting to know what the political dynamics of that are. How do you see that unfolding over the forecast period, over the next few months, in fact?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I mean, I think it's useful to consider the sort of signalling that's coming out of government and the policy implications probably slightly separately. So we're getting some completely unambiguous support for the construction industry in sort of the language that we're hearing. Boris Johnson, he arguably won the election on the back of a 3-word slogan, "Get Brexit done." And now he's come back with some more. So we've got build, 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 which is everywhere this morning and this week, and also building back better. And I think in both those sort of phrases, it's fair to say that the choice of the word build and building is not just a metaphor for rebuilding the economy, although of course that is what they want us to think about, but it's genuinely about putting construction and in particular infrastructure right at the heart of the signalling, the way that they are saying that they want to rebuild the economy, plan for recovery and so on. So that's really unambiguous. I mean, I think Boris Johnson, long been a fan of infrastructure, long before any of this, even before he became Prime Minister. And indeed, the government was already talking about an infrastructure revolution before the pandemic. So in a sense, it's no surprise to see that theme sort of continued. But I think what we're seeing now is that it's really being sort of given a turbocharged, really, in terms of saying, right, this is where we're going to begin in terms of economic recovery. So that's all quite interesting. I also think there's some clear messaging around the government wanting to be seen to support the construction industry. So during lockdown itself, even at the height of lockdown, when most other parts of the economy were essentially closed, construction didn't close completely in quite the same way. Obviously, as you know, bits of it did cease, but there was still construction activity going on. Government was still talking about that. They were aware that people could still see that. We could all still see that there was some roads works going on and things like that as we went about during lockdown. So there's been some messaging there, and I think that is continuing again this week. Boris Johnson and some others have been doing rounds of interviews. There's been a lot of mention again of the Nightingale hospitals, really talking about how impressive it was that they were built so quickly. And again, that's all part of the signalling, and I think signalling support for the industry and a willingness and a confidence to want to back the sector to help drive growth. So I think that's pretty interesting. I mean, we all know that however impressive it was to build those Nightingale hospitals really quickly, it's not the same as a multi-year, multi-billion pound infrastructure project. But I think the government can see that too. And so we've also seen this week trailing of a new infrastructure delivery task force that they're sort of calling Project Speed. Again, the messaging not very subtle there. To try and look at how they get rid of bottlenecks and how they speed up the process and things like that. Now, we don't yet know what that will find or do. But in terms of signalling, they've put Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, in charge. Politically, I think he's considered to have had a pretty good pandemic. So it's, considered a safe pair of hands, someone that's quite well liked. So there's some interesting messaging there. The other thing I think is interesting this week, we've heard a lot from Boris Johnson and indeed Michael Gove. They're talking about Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deal. Now, it's interesting that they're doing that because I don't think that they really think that your average voter is a historical scholar who's going to know the ins and outs of Roosevelt's New Deal necessarily. But I think it sets out a tone that they want to convey that, that New Deal was about pulling America out of the Great Depression. And the fact that they're repurposing that terminology in this case is a very clear signal about the degree to which they're putting an emphasis on infrastructure to build recovery. We are hearing, so moving more onto the policy side of things, there's obviously been trailing today, and in the speech today we're expecting, there's mention of homes, hospitals, schools, prisons, courts, broadband, further education. There's quite a long list of areas where There are announcements being made around intention to get projects off the ground or get things off the ground more quickly than perhaps was originally planned. There are talk about local shovel-ready schemes. Again, that plays well in the in terms of the desire by government to want to bring local areas, particularly those that are considered to have been left behind, as it were, those areas perhaps where people voted Conservative for the first time in December. There's a lot of talk, and indeed there was pre-pandemic, about investment in the North and Midlands. And again, it's possible for them to link up investment in infrastructure on that sort of regional basis. So you can see how there's an attempt to marry up the language, closing the gap, building with what they're actually announcing in terms of money and intention and potentially projects. However, I think it's interesting that the government's infrastructure strategy, which people have been waiting for a long time. There was talk of it coming in March when the budget happened just before the pandemic. It didn't happen then. It isn't coming out today either, and they've now confirmed today that it'll come out in the autumn, presumably alongside the autumn statement, the autumn financial statement. So that's interesting as well. That isn't ready to go, and it'll be interesting to see what's in there that isn't currently being trailed, or how it progresses the things that are being trailed. Again, in terms of things that haven't had so much emphasis, we've not been hearing a great deal about green or environmental infrastructure. There's a bit of talk about, greener infrastructure and green growth. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not been given that much emphasis. So I think it'll be interesting to see potentially whether that does get more attention. And I also think if it doesn't, then that's one area where the government will come under pressure from other people, because I think there will be vociferous people calling for any economic rebuilding to put sort of environmental measures and moves toward net zero at its heart. So I think that there'll be noise around that either way. And then, of course, Alan, you just talked a little bit about commercial and retail. So far, in terms of the politics and the policy, we've not heard a great deal about what the government might do there. And I think that'll be another interesting one to watch.
Great, thank you, Alan and Rebecca, for your insights there. There's so much to talk about, and a 45-minute webinar really can't cover it all. But I think it's clear that there's going to be some definite challenges ahead. But I think with the right focus in the right sectors and around the right investments, there's some opportunities for our industry to help return to what we may call normal levels of the future. So look, we'd like to turn to your questions now, and we're going to ask the panel questions that have been previously submitted, as well as ones that are coming in as we're talking. So I guess the first question that's come in is just, what do we know more about the detail of what the Prime Ministers are going to announce today? And I think that one's for you, Rob, but also Alan, just most importantly, how quickly can they execute this investment so it really starts to make a difference to the economy?
Yeah, so today, the Prime Minister is actually speaking right now as we're on air, and he's talking today about a £5 billion investment. But I think eventually they're also trailing the fact that this is going to be tens of billions, and there was even one quote of 250 billion over a long period of time. Of course, that could be over the next 10 years, in fact. But he's actually quoted as saying it is time to invest in infrastructure. And, Rebecca's point is well made, really, that this very, very much is about build, build, build. The aim is to kickstart the economy, obviously, and level up and create jobs. And they've specifically mentioned social housing, schools, colleges, hospitals, prisons, road rail, and broadband. So it's pretty wide-ranging. And those are all areas that obviously Glenigan will be really focusing on in our research and ensuring that we pick up all these projects at the very earliest possible stage and track them all the way through for you. Now, all this is on top of the 100 billion for HS2 and the 40 billion for Northern Powerhouse Rail, which have already been announced, and in fact they're actually starting now. In terms of the health sector specifically, just to hone in on a few sectors, already we've heard about the 40 new hospitals. But they're going to take a while to come through. So therefore, what's being announced today is 1.5 billion on hospital maintenance. So those are the much quicker projects which can be kicked off straight away. Then it's a similar story in education, really, because there's education was the big focus yesterday of the announcement, and that was about £1 billion for a 10-year multi-wave modernisation. Now, the first wave of those new schools, 50 new schools, are going to be listed in the autumn. So we're going to have that ready in the autumn. As soon as we hear about that, they'll be in the Glenigan database. But they're not due to start until September 2021. So therefore, this year, they've also announced 560 million, so £500 million, on repairs and maintenance to schools. And those obviously would be much faster shovel-ready, I suppose, projects. In addition to that, there's also 200 million for further education colleges, because they're quite keen to build this network of institutes of technology, so that everyone is close enough to an institute of technology throughout the UK. And that really comes back to this whole idea of creating jobs, of raising skill levels and that sort of thing, but really bringing in skills that are appropriate and that are required. A couple of other things were 4 new prisons for 2.4 billion and £100 million short term for 29 road projects. And that includes things like a bridge in Sandwell and the A15 in Humberside. And that's on top of the £27 billion roads programme, which obviously will come to fruition over the next, as I say, 5 to 10 years, really. This is much more short term than that. And then there was another billion for shovel-ready local growth projects. And that's really funneling money into the Stronger Towns Fund, which is 100 or so towns up and down the country which have been identified as being kind of left behind. And so it's roughly between 50 and 100 million each for those towns, so that they can be brought up to 21st century standards. And things like improvements to parks and local transport and high streets and that sort of thing. Has to be said, though, that they are mainly in the Midlands and the North. So it plays back to Rebecca's point, really, about how there is a political element to all this as well. Now, we do know that the details of all of this, we're going to get a bit more detail, I think, next week in the summer statement from the Chancellor. But then the main thing really is the National Infrastructure Strategy, which is, as Rebecca mentioned, due to be published in the autumn. And there's already hinting that, as well as everything I've talked about, they're also talking about energy, roads and rail, of course, but also flood defences and waste in that as well.
Yes, no, I think. Thanks, Rob. That's quite comprehensive sort of summary of the specifics that they're setting out at the moment. But I think one of the key themes from that is what can be delivered now, as in the next sort of 9-12 months, and what's going to take longer to come forward. And I think that was one of the key aspects when we were putting the forecast together. And I think now, short term, there's going to be it's going to be a particular emphasis on, as Rob was saying, on the repair, maintenance, the improvements, whether it's filling potholes, sorting out the severe backlog of disrepair on the school's estate, tackling the hospital estate as well. Those are all things that actually can be switched on pretty quickly and brought forward. And from an employment point of view, repair maintenance is also employment heavy as well. So that's another sort of real positive from that. And then longer term, then alongside that, there are some shovel-ready schemes that can be brought forward quickly in terms of new build projects. I think the Daily Telegraph just last week published an article using our data where they looked at, this is about 48 projects worth a total of about 4 billion on the infrastructure side that can quickly be brought on site within the next 18 months in the currently scheduled to, and then obviously that could potentially be accelerated as well. And then alongside that, there's that longer term strategy. Yes, we've got we've got green light, and we've got some big projects already underway, such as HS2. And then alongside that, there's a building up a momentum of further longer term projects that can be delivered towards the end of this forecast period and beyond. And that's going to be the real sort of way that the government over the longer term is going to be sort of turning the UK economy and rebalancing that UK economy to other, help making sure that all parts of the UK are prospering and growing. So it's a sort of short term and a long term basis, and the key thing is going to be in terms of political intent to drive it forward, not just at central government and departmental area, but they're going to have to really drive things forward. But I think Rob mentioned a number of more local schemes where they want, it's going to need a same sort of drive at the local level to make sure to realise the funds are delivered quickly and effectively and in the right way as well. So it's quite a challenge there, but it can be done.
Yeah, there's certainly a robust execution plan that the government will have to prove that they are able to do to make the difference. And look, a question that's just coming in actually from our live feed, which is an interesting one, is, with all of this planned construction and investment from the government, where are all the skilled construction workers going to come from? We were already short before the pandemic, and now this has sort of exacerbated it more. And I guess there's a political and a construction answer to this as well. So, Rebecca, I don't know if you can help us with that one.
Well, I mean, in a sense, I don't know if I can help, because I don't think we've heard anything from government yet to say where they think these skills will come from. I mean, there is talk about training in a very general sense in some of the narrative at the moment. But I mean, I think it's also interesting that this week in particular, when there's all this talk about infrastructure, there's no talk about Brexit. And, in terms of skills politically, in terms of timing and messaging, it will be interesting to see how that develops over the coming months, when there may be challenges, both political and practical, on the skills front that come from, a massive infrastructure boost to try and recover the economy, and whatever may unfold in relation to Brexit and the way that plays out.
I mean, one of the things that was mentioned today was, as I mentioned earlier, about these institutes of technology. But obviously, they're going to take a long time to come on stream. And I think you're right; the skill levels are required now. I think it's long been the statistic I've always heard is that more people retire from construction every year than are going through the apprentice scheme at the other end to join the industry. And that's been the challenge for years. That's a systemic problem, isn't it? So it's definitely it's going to be a key thing that the government's going to have to look at.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I was going to say the coronavirus is interesting because it's actually kind of it's almost sort of brought forward the issue, but in a slightly different way, because at the moment there's people out there that can work, but they just can't get onto the sites because you've got reduced levels of working. Whereas going forward, once things do build up, then there's got maybe a longer term supply issue. But I think the solution to both of those is work differently, and that's going to be the big challenge for the industry. Whether it's going to looking more off-site, more efficient ways of working and using the labour you've got on site. Maybe it means more use of plant, for example, to get efficiencies going forward. There's all going to be the sort of challenges. And look at the design of the buildings as well. So a lot of it you're going to have to work at the design phase to make sure it's compatible with more off-site manufacture, for example.
Actually, Alan, that's a question that's just pinged in from one of our viewers about modular building methods. And do we think that these will increase, even though modular builders seem to be migrating out of the UK at the moment?
I think it is going to be a growth area. I think certainly, as I say, with the labour supply is restricted, it's going to actually lend more pressure to modular solutions. But you've got to build those solutions in right at the outset, I think, really, to get the full benefit of those, to make sure that A, you've got the efficiencies, and B, that actually it's incorporated into the actual fabric in the right way of the building.
We are identifying more and more projects where they're talking about modern methods of construction in the materials section of our projects, and we're noticing that as a trend it's a long-term trend, but I think it definitely is accelerating.
Interesting. And just around, the differences between refurbishment and new build as well, would you say that the refurbishment market is going to be less affected than the new build market? Obviously, with the changes in working environments, more people working from home, perhaps less demand for office space, certainly in the big cities. What do we expect the refurbishment area to be a bright spot actually for the construction industry at the moment?
I think areas such as you mentioned offices, and I think that's a good example. In terms of, I think if you're looking at the new build side of things, we saw a lot of statements from, I think it was Barclays, for example, thinking, actually, do we need all of these offices? And do we need to have do we need to have those offices where we've got them? So I think there's a lot of thinking going on in boardrooms about how they manage their own estate going forward. And what their overall demand is, and that's clearly, I think developers are going to be thinking the same thing, and I think that's what's going to be holding back the new build side of things. At the same time, there's an awful lot of stock out there. Does it fit those changing working practices? If more people are working flexibly from home for some of the time, you might not need the big open plan office layout you've got at the moment, but you might well want more boardrooms and the meeting rooms and that sort of thing, and breakout areas for people so when they are in, they can work collaboratively, and at the moment safely as well. But I think those are all going to be sort of things that are going to give a big boost, I think, to refurbishment opportunities. And it's not just going to be there.
I was speaking with a developer only last week, and they were talking about the offices moving from somewhere where you did work to somewhere where you come up with ideas. They actually termed it an ideas factory, and a collaborative space where you get together occasionally and trade ideas, brainstorm, this sort of thing, come up with new ideas, and then go away and develop those, probably working at home. So it's a change. I mean, I think this is an example of one of those trends that was probably happening anyway, very slowly, but because of the pandemic, because of the lockdown, we've all had to adapt to this, and we found that we can actually, and it works perfectly well.
Yeah.
So therefore, I think this has shifted things forward. It's almost a generational shift that's happened just in a matter of a few months.
It's certainly been accelerated, hasn't it, and made us all face the opportunities that it presents, I suppose, and have to make them a success. So another question just coming in from our viewers, and it's around the emphasis on implementing and integrating technology to increase productivity in the construction sector. And I guess that's something that traditionally we have been less forward thinking with as an industry, and just what moves are both the sector and the government, I guess, Rebecca, as well for you, going to help in aiding that sort of transition that perhaps needs to be made now to really reap the benefits from technology?
I mean, I think it'll be interesting politically. There's, again, when you think about the language versus the policy, I mean, the whole phrase shovel ready is not the most sort of digitally focused, forward-thinking phrase, is it? I mean, we know what it means, and of course, in that sense, it's useful. I don't think the government will think it's their responsibility per se to sort of digitalise the construction industry, but they might expect the industry to do it. So, I mean, I'm just speculating, but that Project Speed may well have a work stream that looks around technology. Of course, it would make sense for it to do so. If it's going to look at how to remove bottlenecks, if it's going to look at how to speed up major long-term infrastructure projects, then I think one would expect it to look at how technology can be used in a better way, and how to think, going back to your question about skills, how to accelerate digital upskilling within the construction industry as well. And I think it probably still be for the industry to do it.
I think the government tried to mandate the use of BIM, didn't it, a few years back, and it was a bit of a failure, to be honest, because I don't think that the industry was ready, and I don't think the focus was on it. So all of that focus on BIM seems to have kind of dissipated. So whether they'll try again and push that through over the next few years, maybe that's the case. We can certainly monitor that on the Glenigan database. We identify whether a project is designed via BIM. So that's something that we can keep a close eye on as well.
And I think it's going to be interesting as well, because we've seen that before with some technologies previously, that it's a bit like the dot-com bubble we saw sort of about 20, 30 years ago, whatever it was. Everyone said, oh, this is all going to change, and it was a bubble, it dissipated, but then all the technology did happen. It will happen after that. It just didn't happen quite the timing, people, and it may well be the same thing now. There a lot of work's been done on BIM. Maybe it'll just get picked up now and can help to drive forward, particularly on the design side, where there's got to be a lot of efficiencies. As you say, if you're trying to accelerate the construction process and get things to that shovel-ready stage, you want to get you want to truncate that design work, but you don't want to compromise that design work. So anything there on the digital front that can help to accelerate and improve, particularly the collaborative working side of things, has got to be a real boon to delivering projects faster.
Yes, thank you. The other way that the government can obviously make a difference is to address some of the rather tight restrictions around the planning law. And there were some announcements just last week about some changes in that space. Rob, perhaps you'd like to share with us just the high level changes there that will aid the industry in getting back to normal.
Yeah. Last week it was the Business and Planning Bill that got enacted, which includes some temporary changes to the planning system to address the coronavirus crisis, but also support economic recovery. The 2 points in tandem, really. And really what it's meant to be is a new fast-track application process. That's what they were talking about. And I do notice that actually in his speech right now, Boris Johnson has just talked about the chronic failure to build enough new homes, and he's pledged to build fantastic new homes on brownfield sites and other areas with better transport. And the way he says he's going to do this is by introducing the most radical reforms to our planning system since the end of the Second World War, apparently. Okay. And I think what was announced last week rather, is the first step along the road for that, to this new fast-track application process. Initially, it was around extending the planning permission deadlines. So it was any sites with an expiry date between the start of lockdown and the end of this year have had their consents extended to April 2021. So that was the first thing, a really short-term enabler. But then they're also talking about allowing working hours on sites to be extended. And that's something that at Glenigan, we've picked up a lot of planning amendments around working longer hours. So later into the night, starting earlier, potentially even working overnight and working at weekends as well, just to be able to get over this thing of only having, say, 60-70% of the headcount on site. So therefore, you still get the thing delivered on time. But they're also talking, and comes back to the earlier point really, about dealing with things like planning appeals and inspection of documents online, so that they can just speed up the whole process and enabling faster planning appeals and that sort of thing. So I really think that the government are coming up with lots of different ways of looking at this issue, which I think the developers for years now have pointed the finger at planning as being one of the major obstacles to delivering more and faster development.
I think the politics there are quite interesting potentially as well, because planning is one of those things that's talked about as being an area that Dominic Cummings has in his sights to reform. And it will be interesting to see what sort of form that could take. I mean, Rob, you're talking about very sort of practical measures in the here and now that can speed things up. And obviously,
short term, yes.
Digitalisation and things like that, different working hours. I think the sort of bigger picture stuff around, how retail sites or shopping centres that maybe never return to what they were before, how they might be repurposed. In similar questions around offices, I think could all be interesting. And then, of course, you've still got the interplay around local democracy. I mean, if they're talking about levelling up and things like that, there's some interesting ways in which it could play out, because the desire to speed up planning at the moment, some of the time that's built into planning is around consultation and things like that. So I think there's some quite interesting political questions or potential tensions there that will be interesting to watch as well.
Indeed. Just a question coming in around London now, and the impact on London. I think from a commercial and a residential point of view, we saw in the headlines this morning Redrow scaling back their London residential work, and obviously with perhaps offices becoming less popular and less people commuting into the city and more people wanting to move out of the city. What do we think the overall impact on London is going to be? In the next sort of 6, 12, 18 months.
Certainly within our forecasts, London and the southeast actually are weaker performing parts of the country. It's very much, some of that is to do with the north and the Midlands benefiting from increased government investment and the focus on infrastructure and development there. But I think also it's a reflection perhaps of their exposure, particularly in London. Half of all office accommodation, for example, is in the capital. It's been a major growth driver for London for a number of years. But certainly over the last 3 years, for example, the central London housing market, that's been an underperformer compared with the UK as a whole. Everyone talks about London house prices being the highest as they are, but they've been weakening already. And this, I think, the whole over the next couple of years, I think that's going to continue as well. We're moving in sort of post-Brexit scenario as well. So all of those sort of things, I think, are going to be more of a drag on the capital than they are on other parts of the country.
And I guess we're seeing this sort of initial post-lockdown boom in housing transactions that seems to be happening, and whether that's sustainable or not, none of us know yet. I mean, we're seeing sort of predictions of a 7 to 10% drop in house prices coming next year. So do you think that sort of transaction boom that we're seeing at the moment is being driven by people wanting to move out of the big cities, or people panicking about house prices dropping in the next 12 months? What do you think's driving that, Alan?
I think there does seem to be some anecdotal evidence of that people have thinking, well, and even they may be thinking, well, let's do it now in case there's another lockdown and we're stuck in our apartment again. So I think that is an incentive. So you've got that short-term thinking, but also longer term. If you are going to be thinking, well, actually in the future I'm not going to be commuting every day into the office, I'm going to be commuting maybe once or twice a week, then actually I don't have to live so close to work. So even if it is going into London, I can live further afield and travel in. So it means travel patterns are going to change quite a lot as a result of that, and also the demand for residential in terms of house prices and supply. Now, obviously, that's going to be new challenges for the planning system and all that sort of thing, because the demand is going to be changing and shifting to from where it has been planned for in the past.
Indeed. Okay, well, unfortunately, that's actually all we have time for today. I hope that you found this session useful and that you've taken away the information that can help your business. It's clear that the industry has changed, possibly forever, as a result of COVID-19, but we've already seen examples of how firms can adapt to the new business landscape and even embrace new opportunities that simply didn't exist before. Please download the full forecast report for much more detail on the market performance in your business sectors. And if there's anything that we can do to support your business in the forthcoming months, please do get in touch, because we're here to help. For now, though, all that remains is for me to say thank you to our panel, to Alan Whelan, Rebecca and Robert for joining us and sharing their insight with us today. And we thank you for joining the Glenagan webinar. Good afternoon.